So in talking about this relationship between the superego and the id in a more Freudian context, but to use it in a more Robert Louis Stevenson sense, the idea of the higher versus the lower self, right, the flesh and the spirit, maybe if one wanted to use a more Pauline terminology, right? When Enfield and Utterson talk about Hyde and how they encountered him, he talks about repulsion, right, that he feels repelled by Mr. Hyde. This phrase coming from this verb repel that means to push away, right? Or to push back, right? Repulsion means if you feel repulsion, you feel like you just want to get away from something. You want to get it away from you like it was rancid or disgusting, right? The noun, if you want to call someone, someone who is disgusting, you just want to push them away, the noun is repulsive, right? If you find, normally like you might find a certain food repulsive, or you find something that's extremely ugly or a behavior that's extremely ugly, repulsive, right? And so what is interesting in terms of how does this relate to what we're talking about, the idea is the higher self, in this case, in the Freudian term, the superego, it feels a natural repulsion to the id. It wants to push it away. But not only does it want to push it away, it often wants to push it down, right? And that's kind of what is being hinted at here. And this works not only on the level of the psyche and how Robert Louis Stevenson is approaching it, it also works on the level of social class, right? Because the idea, right, of different levels, these levels don't just have to be represented by levels of the mind, because we all know that Jekyll is up here, we know that Hyde is down here, right? But this doesn't only work on levels of the mind or levels of morality, it also works in terms of levels of society. That which we find repulsive is pushed down to the bottom. And in that sense, it's almost like how, it's part of being the tradition of kosher, right? We take things that are disgusting and we put them far away. Interestingly enough, the word that we often is used for punishment in the Gospels is this place called Gehenna, right? When Jesus talks about, those who will be punished or damned will burn in fiery Gehenna, this is the place for the burning of trash, right? And that's why it's always smelling so bad, right? It's a place where it's literally always filthy because it's the place where you put filthy stuff to burn it and to get rid of it, right? And in the same sense, human trash, or rather than getting helped, right, tends to be pushed down. One of the ironies about Jekyll as a character is that he is an MD. He's a medical doctor. The idea is he, in his mission, is trying to help people, but it is still the tendency of society when we think someone is ill or sick or there's something wrong with them, our first tendency is to want to push them away or push them down or get rid of them or to banish them to kind of the garbage places in society. One of the things that was particularly bad in that time was the treatment of the insane. One of the things that we may not know is that if people were sent to an asylum, it was like a death sentence. I mean, in asylums, they would experiment on people. It's why there are a lot of horror movies made about mental asylums, and where people would basically be forgotten and they would be put through these kind of treatments to make them sane. I mean, they were these just awful prisons. Being in an asylum was very much like being in a prison. On a different level, right, when we talk about what's going on, right, one of the things when they see Jekyll, right, and he talks about how he speaks drearily, right, coming from this term dreary, which just means dull, lifeless, depressed, depressed, all sorts of these things. This is the idea, right, that Jekyll, right, he says it won't last for much longer, right? Very much like Lanyon, who predicted his own death, it seems that Jekyll might be trying to do the same. What Utterson suggests, he says, I venture, right? I was about to venture. He talks about venture. A venture can be like a risky undertaking, right? And he talks about how, I venture to ask you, right, as if it were risky, to ask Jekyll to come out, that you should take a walk with us, and whip up the circulation, right? It's kind of funny because there are a lot of different uses of the words circular and circulation in this text. In this case, circulation simply refers to blood circulation, right? The general idea that we're seeing here is that something which is healthy and good is something that gets out. It doesn't remain like confined to one place. It interacts. Like a healthy body has good circulation of the blood, and it also circulates in and out of the community. The idea of being able to circulate in the community is the idea that a thing which is truly healthy, right, doesn't remain in one place. You'll notice that running water tends to be a lot more clean than water that's stagnant, right? In the same way, right, the idea of evil is when evil is pushed down and it kind of has a place that's relegated for it, right? Evil is a place, or we don't put garbage in a place where it'll circulate around, right? And that's why garbage and garbage places tend to always get smellier and worse, because it doesn't circulate, it just accumulates, right? So this idea, though, when he suggests, I was about to venture to ask you to come out, right? Why is it a risky thing? Because that's what the word, venture just generally means a risky or a risky undertaking. Why would he use this word venture, right? The idea is that he understands that Jekyll, right, it's very difficult for Jekyll to leave the house. And also that there is some kind of risk of having Jekyll out of where he is. That this voluntary self-confinement does seem to be done in order to prevent risk for himself and risk for others. So that choice of words shows that Utterson has some kind of intuitive idea of what's going on. One of the things that it says about Jekyll, that he is disconsolate. This is a very interesting choice of words, disconsolate. That means he's unable to be consoled, right? It comes from this word console, right? Right? And that generally, when we say console, right, like they're there helping someone else feel better. The word console comes from con, meaning with, right? Pretty sure you know that by now. And also the Latin solatio, which is the Latin for solitude. This is kind of a strange word, but it's really beautiful, because the word consolation or to console, when it means with solitude, right, you can't really be with solitude, right? Solitude means alone. So when you say with solitude, you're basically with someone in their solitude, so it ceases to be solitude. It's to undo their aloneness. To console someone is not only to try to make them feel better, but it's also to enter into their experience, enter into their solitude, to be truly present. In this case, right, Jekyll, who is unable to be consoled, is really unable to be with anyone else anymore. And he was going to suggest just talking right from the window, but all of a sudden he has this change go over him, and he all of a sudden can't talk to them anymore, and he doesn't even say why. And they talk about how afterwards they have a look of abject terror, right? Abject in this case simply means to the full extent, right? Right? The maximum, right? So they just have, even with only a glimpse, right? That's another word he uses. You probably know what the word glimpse means. That just means brief or momentary look, right? But even with only a momentary look, right? They know that with his all of a sudden slamming the window and ceasing to talk with them, they know that something is seriously wrong. There's something very erratic about this behavior. And one of the reasons, right, like, is this idea of isolation, his inability to go out, his total isolation. One of the things that we see, and we're familiar with this, because you've got to remember, this is a person who's like a medical doctor right now, right? Normally a medical doctor tries to lift someone up, right? He doesn't necessarily just push everything down or just, a good doctor tries to heal things, doesn't just amputate anything. But one of the things that's going to lead to the fall of Dr. Jekyll is the idea that he does kind of take that approach. He tries to amputate Mr. Hyde in a certain case. And we'll talk more about this when we read Dr. Jekyll's confession. But in his effort to amputate Mr. Hyde, he actually kills himself. Freudians, what they will talk about is the idea that a human being cannot survive without the id, that the id is actually a necessary part of the protection of the human psyche. Robert Louis Stevenson, he would simply say, because he wasn't exactly Freudian, because he's really before Freud, but the idea to separate oneself and to cut oneself off is literally not good for the circulation, right? It's literally not good for the circulation of one's body or one's soul. One of the things that we should understand about how this is working and how this whole story is coming together is that this word, you'll know what this word means, right? What Jekyll is doing is kind of like a self-quarantine, right? Like he's literally trying to keep the disease at bay. His own disease he's trying to push down. He's also trying to keep it from affecting the rest of the world. The idea of a self-quarantine, I mean, now more than ever, we understand what Dr. Jekyll is doing. This is kind of the ironic thing about teaching Jekyll and Hyde right now. But the thing is this quarantine that Jekyll is trying to do was not only a quarantine first separating himself from the rest of society once he had completely lost control, but also it is the fact that it started with him trying to quarantine evil within himself, right? Trying to quarantine, trying to push it down, trying to relegate it all to a certain place. In Mr. Hyde, right, we know that when Jekyll becomes Hyde, he doesn't stay and live where Jekyll lives. He goes to Soho, right? He goes to those nasty neighborhoods. All of his sinning, all of his evil life is confined to the places of garbage, right? The idea of Victorian society that it seems that Robert Louis Stevenson is trying to address is that kind of like the house or kind of like whatever. The idea is what happens in Soho stays in Soho, right? Right? Anything, like you have good England here, right? And everything that's nasty, the immigrants, the criminals, the poor, the insane, the prostitutes, right? All of that we just kind of put in the garbage pit, the Gehenna, the Soho, right? And by doing that, right, we keep the rest of everything clean, right? It's like having a bathroom, like you have a sewer, right? Everything goes to its proper place. But the thing about a good and healthy sewer is that it still pumps the waste away. It uses running water to push everything away. Instead of what Soho is, which is not like a sewer, it's more like a cesspool, right? Where everything just sits, right? That's the difference between a healthy thing like a sewer and a disgusting thing like a cesspool where everything just sits and accumulates. If you know when you don't have good waste management in any city, what ends up happening is the cesspool, it invites rats and whatever, and then what happens? Plague, right? Something else we're familiar with right now. So the idea is it doesn't work to just quarantine all the bad stuff in one area and think that it's not going to outgrow its enclosure and eventually kind of spread like a cancer and spread like a disease, right? That without the right, that the social ills of society cannot be addressed just by ignoring it or trying to push it away in a kind of like apartheid or apartness in order to, if you didn't know, apartheid was a social system in South Africa where they forced the poor people, who were black, to live separately from the whites, right? It was a complete and total racial segregation, right? In the same way, and by the way, the apartheid of London and Soho was also partly along racial lines. The idea is that you cannot just get rid of evil by pushing it somewhere else. It comes back on you. It multiplies and it makes problems that eventually will reach up out of the cesspool and come into your normal living spaces. That's what we see with the murder of Danvers Carew, who was not murdered in Soho, right? But it also is a commentary on the hypocrisy of a lot of the people in Victorian England who wanted to indulge in drinking and prostitution and opium, it was called chasing the dragon, that wanted to engage in these behaviors, but they also wanted to have this upright way of life. So they could go to Soho in disguise or in Soho wearing crappy clothes, because oftentimes, right, with the amount of makeup that people would wear and the wigs and the other things, they could dress differently and you would not even know who they were. This also, by the way, is the subject behind the famous American novel, The Prince and the Pauper, by Mark Twain, where he suggests oftentimes we identify people not by their looks, but by their clothes. The idea that we need to understand here is that the level of appearance, right, when you deal with evil at the level of appearance, right, and only at the level of appearance, right, it grows out of control. It has to be dealt with to the root. If you don't deal with it to the root, if you don't actually try to reform Soho, Soho will only grow and expand, right? Unless you find a way to actually deal with these problems of society, they don't just go away. They grow out of the confines of the pit, right? A landfill it's not a bottomless pit. Eventually you need a new landfill. It will expand, it will grow, right? And that is kind of the general idea that we see here. So I'm getting to my end of the time for this video, so we're just gonna have one more after this.